But tonight, I think we have a special audience on C-SPAN. Tonight, I think it is entirely possible that we are going to have the wealthiest section of crowd audience television viewers in the history of C-SPAN. You know why? They got a bill coming up, a bill that is designed for them, for the wealthiest people in America. And so they're probably at this point trying to figure out how to live stream C-SPAN onto their yachts so they can see if this tax bill is going to pass. Why would they do that? Why would they be tuned in? Because this is the biggest tax break for the wealthiest people in the history of tax code reform. It is. It turns out that in 2027, 83% of the tax breaks in this bill go to the top 1% of wage earners in America. Boy, how could you sit down and write a tax bill that is so lopsided for the wealthiest people in America? You had to have said to the staff, first, find out what taxes are left that the wealthy might pay and get rid of them. Reduce them right and left, and they did. Imagine that's your starting point for tax code reform in America, that you are ignoring working families and the reality of the life that they lead. You're ignoring small and medium-sized businesses, and you're focusing on the wealthiest people in America and the biggest corporations. You know what I found in Illinois? When you travel around my state and meet the business leaders and ask them point blank, tell me about federal taxes, the biggest corporations never complain because the tax code is loaded with escape hatches for the biggest and wealthiest corporations and individuals. It's the small and medium-sized businesses that pay the most taxes. They're the ones who should have been the biggest beneficiaries on this bill. And secondly, the working families. People that are struggling paycheck to paycheck, can't save money for their kids' future, worried about their kids' student loans. Wouldn't it have been great if this tax code reform really focused on them instead of the wealthiest people in America? You know, it's a stereotype, I know, that the Republicans worry about the rich instead of the working folks. But when you look at this bill, sadly, that's the reality. Here's the good news, if there's any good news in that terrible story that I just recounted. The American people get it. They understand it. How in the world could you write a bill and call it tax reform and tax cuts and have 2/3 of America hate it instantly? They did it. Congratulations. You put together a bill which instinctively the American people knew was a bad deal for them. And it is. When you take a look at this bill, you'll realize why we're asked to vote on this Republican tax plan, a plan written behind closed doors and rushed through Congress on a last-minute rush this year. It's because the Republicans are bound and determined to have something that they passed this year. In all fairness, they passed the defense authorization bill, but they spent month after month on repeal and failure to replace our health care system. And now, before they leave town at the end of this calendar year, they're bound and determined to get this done, whatever it takes, their so-called tax reform plan. After a year in control of Congress and the White House, and extraordinarily few legislative achievements to show for it, Republicans are forcing through this partisan tax plan only a few short weeks after it was unveiled. You may not remember, unless you were watching C-SPAN that night, I came to the floor when we finally were given the Senate tax bill. It was about 500 pages long. And as I was going through it on page 257, I remember the page, I looked at it and I thought, what is this? There was a page in the middle of the tax bill with all sorts of scribbled handwriting, which was absolutely impossible to read. Now remember, this is a tax code that is going to have an impact on individuals, families, and businesses to the tune of millions of dollars. And here was a page in it which no one could read. And you know why I know no one can read it? I submitted it to the record, and the clerk of the Senate came and found me afterwards and said, Senator, we can't put this in the congressional record because we can't read it. That's what was going on here in writing the tax code of the United States of America. It was a slapdash, hurried effort that sadly does not reflect the best of this institution or the best of the members who are part of it. Why would they do this? Because if this bill were subject to proper scrutiny, as it should have been, you only really reform the tax code once every several decades, a monumental giveaway to corporate America would have emerged, and a tax break or giveaway for the wealthiest Americans. So while most families are focused on getting ready for the holidays, my Republican colleagues and friends are hoping most Americans will be too busy to notice them passing a tax bill that will raise taxes on middle-income families. This is supposed to be the greatest deliberative body in the world, the United States Senate. And my Republican colleagues threw out regular order and bipartisan input right out the window of the Capitol. They spent the past 2 weeks behind closed doors writing the final version of this tax bill. Only last Friday, we finally saw the text of this tax plan, fully released, fully revealed. More than 1,000 pages of new tax code, and that's what we're expected to understand and to vote on in a matter of days. Are the memories of my Republican colleagues so short they forgot their repeated calls of read the bill when we considered the Affordable Care Act? Did they forget their criticism of that process, which took place, incidentally, over many months, characterized by transparency, multiple bipartisan hearings, and included well over 100 Republican amendments? Have they forgotten all the criticism they leveled on that effort to try to provide health insurance for more Americans? This is no way for major legislation to be written, this tax bill before us. And it certainly reflects the best wishes and hardest work of many of the lobbyists and corporate donors who benefit my Republican colleagues. Is it any wonder that after this rushed process, the initial analysis of the final bill shows that millions of working families in Illinois and across the nation will be hurt, while the wealthiest 1% of wage earners in America receive a massive windfall? Sadly, it's no surprise. In their plan, Republicans chose to make essentially all individual provisions in the tax bill temporary in order to pay for massive permanent corporate cuts that'll make overwhelming benefits for the wealthy investors. The result, as I said, when the bill is fully phased in 2027, more than half of all Americans will see their taxes increase under the Republican plan. These are tax increases that will be felt particularly hard by those in households in the bottom 60% and those families with kids. By 2027, while middle-income families pay a higher tab, the richest 1% of Americans will receive a whopping 83% of all the tax cuts under this plan. I just can't believe they pulled this off, that the Republicans figured out how to give 83% of the tax breaks to the top 1% of wage earners in America and sell it as tax reform to help working families. It's indefensible. This devastating result was baked into the DNA of this Republican plan from the start. There's no greater example of this than the Republicans' determination to erode state and local tax deductions. It used to be a standard principle in American taxation that you wouldn't tax people on the money they paid in other taxes. We don't tax a tax until this bill came along. We used to say if you pay a state income tax, that amount of money, or a state sales tax, or a state property tax, we're not going to impose a federal tax on your tax payment. No tax on a tax. They didn't buy it. They changed it. They put limits on the amount of deduction that you can make for this. And what does it mean? Ask the realtors in my state or the home builders, and they'll tell you that this is going to be a damper on economic growth in the state of Illinois, a growth that we desperately need in my state to create jobs and opportunities. This vital deduction is taken by nearly 1/3 of all taxpayers, and taxpayers in my home state benefit from it among the most in the nation. The principle is simple. Illinoisans under the new Republican plan will start paying federal taxes on the local state property taxes that they pay, and they don't receive the deduction that historically has been there. Republicans apparently feel differently because in the face of weeks of warnings from realtors, home builders, local school districts, state and local officials, and first responders about the increased difficulty which the elimination of this deduction will create, it didn't deter them one bit, and every single Illinois Republican congressman ignored all of this and voted for this terrible plan. It means higher tax bills for middle-income families in my state and many others, and a strain on crucial state and local investments in education, infrastructure, and public safety. That isn't the only hit to middle-income families. Here's the one that I find the most reprehensible. Millions of people will lose health insurance because of this tax reform bill. It guts one of the major provisions of the Affordable Care Act. After failing miserable to achieve one of their campaign promises to repeal the Affordable Care Act and take away health care from millions of families, Republicans slipped into this tax bill a provision that undermines the Affordable Care Act. And the net result of it is an increase of 10 to 20% for health insurance premiums for those buying in the marketplace. And, this is a kicker, 13 million Americans are going to lose health insurance because of this tax reform bill that's brought to us by the Republicans. I don't see how you can go home to any state and say, good news, I gave a tax break to the wealthiest people in America and the biggest corporations, and average working folks here are going to lose their health insurance. How can you stand up and say that is good for your state or for this country? Republicans' efforts to take away health care from families and give tax cuts to the wealthy shouldn't surprise us. The surprise here is that so many of the so-called fiscal hawks, how many times have I heard my Republican colleagues come to the floor and pose for holy pictures when it comes to the national debt? Oh, it goes over and over again, the speeches they give when there's a Democratic president. Now that there's a Republican president, political amnesia has set in. It turns out that this Republican tax reform, giving tax breaks to the wealthy and not to the middle-income families of America, will add $1.5 trillion to our national debt. So who will pay off that debt for these tax breaks to the wealthy? I'm afraid it's our kids and our grandkids. Somehow these fiscal hawks are able to convince themselves that cutting taxes on the wealthy is worth a new burden on our kids. When you get past all the fancy rhetoric, the bottom line is that Republicans believe we can afford to add $1.5 trillion to the debt if it means giving tax cuts to the wealthy. But we can't afford it as a nation when we know that we need to make massive investments in things that mean a lot to working families. Shouldn't we have put more money in fighting the opioid crisis? Claimed almost 2,000 lives last year in my home state of Illinois. Shouldn't we have put more money in helping kids go to college so they aren't burdened with student loans that change their lives? Shouldn't we have put more money into medical research? Couldn't we have put more money into investing in our infrastructure? No. The Republicans say there's a much higher priority: tax cuts for wealthy people. What does make sense to my constituents and millions more across America is that a $1.5 trillion increase in the national debt poses a real threat to our economic future and a threat to the future of Medicare and Medicaid. Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House, Republican leader, said they're going to take care of the added deficit and debt by cutting entitlement programs like Medicare and Medicaid. I would say to Paul Ryan, my neighbor from Wisconsin, you're in for a fight, my friend. And it won't be just the Democrats. It'll be a lot of folks in Wisconsin who aren't going to stand for that outcome. Americans deserve better than what the Republican leaders in Congress have brought to us with this bill, rushed through without bipartisan consideration and without review by experts. This may be a, quote, big political win for the Republican Party and their donors, but it's on the backs of hardworking families. Some of these consequences they're going to face are already dangerously clear. Others, which we'll only discover as we pore through the fine print on this 1,000-page bill, we can only guess what they will mean. Mr. President, I yield the floor.